It did not start with a speech. It started with a list of 5 demands from Washington laid out during the review of the trade deal that underpins most of North America's economic life. Dairy, digital media, government procurement, alcohol restrictions, energy, the kind of list that usually disappears into closed rooms where officials bargain, delay, blur, and quietly trade one concession for another. But this time, every line on the list landed in public, and within 24 hours, Mark Carney's answer was effectively no to all 5. Not half, no, not yet. Not the usual diplomatic language that says we remain committed to dialogue while everyone keeps pretending the pressure is still working, just a rejection. That was the moment, because the real story is not that Trump's team made demands. The real story is that when those demands arrived, they hit a Canadian system that had already been hardened in advance. That is what changes everything. What Washington thought was a negotiation turned out to be something much more dangerous, an audit of its own leverage, and the audit did not come back clean. That is the whole argument. This is not a normal trade dispute. This is a test of whether Canada is still dependent enough on the United States to bargain from fear, or whether Ottawa has already moved far enough toward economic sovereignty that fear no longer clears the table. Once you see that, every piece falls into place. Start with the part Washington did not frame as the first issue, even though it sits underneath all the others. Energy. The United States imports roughly 3.8 million barrels of crude oil per Dalton Y from Canada. That is around 23% of total American refinery feedstock. More importantly, much of the refining system on the Gulf Coast is specifically built around Canadian heavy sour crude. That is not just foreign oil. It is foreign oil built into the machinery of American industry. Add winter electricity dependence in New England, and the picture gets even sharper. The relationship is not a favor, it is a necessity, and that matters because every other demand sits on top of that quiet dependence. When one side knows the other side cannot easily rewire one of the deepest structural links in the relationship, every other threat changes shape. Pressure stops looking total. It starts looking selective. And once pressure starts looking selective, the weaker side starts asking a different question: where exactly can the stronger side still afford to push? That is the first shift. Now move to dairy, because dairy looks small until you understand what it really represents. On paper, the American complaint is simple. Canada's supply management system blocks access. Tariffs beyond quota can rise above 200%. That sounds outrageous if you present it in pure market language. But inside Canada, supply management is not just a tariff system. It is a political and social stabilizer. It protects thousands of farms, especially in Quebec, and it preserves a domestic structure Ottawa has decided is too politically valuable to expose to continental price war logic. And this time Canada did more than defend it rhetorically. It protected it legislatively. That is decisive, because once the thing you want to negotiate is no longer just a policy preference, but part of a legal barrier, the bargaining chip changes category. It stops being flexible. It becomes structural. Even if a government wanted to yield, it would now have to spend political capital just to rebuild the room for surrender. That is not negotiation strength on Washington's side. That is preemptive hardening on Ottawa's side. Now go to digital media, where the fight gets even more revealing. Washington says Canada's streaming and online news rules discriminate against American firms like Netflix, Spotify, YouTube, and the wider US platform ecosystem. Ottawa says something much more dangerous than that. Ottawa says this is not just a revenue issue, it is a sovereignty issue. A country sitting beside the biggest content machine in the world is trying to decide whether it still gets to preserve a national pipeline of culture, revenue, and narrative, or whether all of that is simply absorbed by scale from the South. That is why this was never just about fairness. It was about control. Who gets the money? Who gets the audience? Who gets the cultural steering wheel? And once a trade dispute reaches that level, you are no longer asking a government to accept lower margins. You are asking it to accept a smaller self. That is why Carney could reject it so quickly. Washington read this as an economic complaint. Ottawa had already elevated it into a question of statehood. Then comes procurement. And procurement is where the American case almost collapses under its own weight. The United States wants provincial access. It wants American companies treated more equally in public purchasing. But the American system itself is saturated with domestic preference. Buy American is not rhetoric. It is embedded into federal contracts, infrastructure logic, military spending, and political identity. So for Canada to loosen domestic procurement while the United States holds its own lines would not feel like reciprocity. It would feel like unilateral exposure. That is why this demand was never strong. It was loud, but it was not strong. Now, take the alcohol issue, because that one reveals the sequencing trap at the center of the whole confrontation. Several Canadian provinces restricted American alcohol only after the United States imposed tariffs on Canadian goods. That means Canada's move was retaliatory. It was an answer, not the opening shot. So when Washington asks for those restrictions to be lifted while its own pressure remains in place, it is not really offering negotiation. It is asking Canada to stop defending itself while the punishment continues. That is not bargaining, that is submission language, and this is why the answer came back so quickly. Now look at what was conspicuously not placed at the center of the list. Autos. That silence is one of the most revealing details in the entire story, because everybody involved knows the North American auto industry is not a trade lane. It is a single integrated system. Parts cross the border multiple times before final assembly. Factories on one side depend on engines, components, logistics, and sequencing from the other side. The entire network saves tens of billions of dollars because it functions as one industrial organism rather than three separate national ones. Washington was careful there because it had to be pushed too hard in autos, and you do not punish Canada alone. You destabilize your own manufacturers, your own political constituencies, and one of the most important industrial systems inside your own economy that tells you something crucial. The list looked broad. The room to push was narrower than it looked. That is the pattern across the entire package. Push on dairy, you hit Canadian law. Push on digital media, you hit Canadian identity. Push on procurement, you expose American hypocrisy. Push on alcohol, you expose sequencing weakness. Push on autos, you hurt your own side. And under all of it sits energy, which the United States cannot replace quickly enough to threaten as if it were optional. That is why the list failed to produce what Washington expected. Each demand was supposed to expose Canadian vulnerability. Instead, each one exposed American constraint. And once that happens, the emotional meaning of the standoff changes. What looks like Canadian defiance on the surface becomes something much more serious underneath. American transparency, the pressure revealed what Washington wants. It also revealed what Washington cannot easily afford to lose. That is dangerous in any negotiation, because once the weaker side discovers where the stronger side is structurally limited, fear starts draining out of the room. Now add the most important layer of all. Canada did not merely reject inward, it had already started building outward. For decades, roughly 3/4 of Canadian exports went to the United States. That kind of concentration creates the habit of caution. It teaches every government that survival begins with access, and that access must be preserved above almost everything else. But that is the older Canadian model. The newer one is more dispersed. Agricultural openings with China, more active positioning toward Europe. Domestic procurement, redirecting roughly $70 billion toward Canadian suppliers, federal-provincial alignment around strategic sectors, critical minerals position not just as export goods, but as future leverage inside clean energy and AI supply chains. Those developments do not replace the U.S. market. They do not have to. They only have to do one thing: reduce panic, reduce the old feeling that every no is existential. That is the deepest change in the whole story. Canada is no longer bargaining from pure dependence. It is bargaining from managed exposure. And once that happens, pressure stops generating automatic movement. It starts generating strategic refusal. That is why Davos mattered when Carney said that countries not seated at the table end up on the menu. It was not just a line, it was a translation. He was taking a trade review and reframing it as a wider geopolitical problem. Middle powers that failed to build sovereignty become objects inside other people. As bargaining systems, Washington heard that as posture. A lot of the world heard something else. They heard Canada signaling that it no longer intended to live only as a bilateral dependency. Now look back south, because the contradiction inside Washington is one of the most revealing parts of all this. Trump talks publicly as if the deal may not matter, but his own trade representative lays out detailed terms for extending it. Greer cites roughly $960 billion in U.S. exports under the agreement and major growth since implementation. American industry groups from autos to energy to agriculture urge continuation. Those things do not line up with a story of irrelevance. They line up with a story of importance. And that is why the pressure is so revealing. No administration builds this much public pressure around a framework it truly believes it can walk away from without pain. The more Washington pushes, the more it reveals what is at stake inside its own industrial base. That is why this moment matters. Not because Canada rejected 5 demands, because the rejection may have exposed that the old fear model no longer works the way Washington assumed it still did. And once fear stops working automatically, the whole continental order starts shifting. Now, we are moving toward the structural checkpoint in July. There are only 3 real paths of full extension: a withdrawal or annual reviews stretching uncertainty out year by year. That third option will sound moderate to many people. It is not moderate, it is corrosion. Annual uncertainty poisons investment. Autos, energy, manufacturing, critical minerals, infrastructure planning, these sectors do not live on one-year political moods. They live on long capital timelines, stretch uncertainty to 2036, and you do not preserve the system. You slowly train capital to hedge away from it. And here is the deepest irony. If Washington keeps using pressure this way, it may accelerate exactly what it wants to stop. Every unresolved demand gives Ottawa more reason to widen alternatives. Every review cycle rewards preparation over accommodation. Every threat strengthens the Canadian case that leverage now comes from flexibility, not dependence. That is the real shift. This is not just a standoff over 5 demands. It is a struggle over whether North America remains organized around automatic American coercive centrality or drifts toward a looser, harder, more sovereignty-driven order. That is what changes everything. Not the list by itself, not even the rejection by itself. The fact that the rejection may have been structurally prepared long before the list ever appeared